The crime of Holcomb, Kansas is something very important in the history of writing in America. All the good readers know something about Perry, about the creative process of Capote, but we will talk about that topic only seven minutes. Truman Capote.
Found yourself totally hooked on a true crime documentary or binge listen to an investigative explainer series until 2 a.m., you literally owe it to the exact moment in history we are looking at today. We're going to explore how a horrifying real-life tragedy was meticulously transformed into a completely groundbreaking literary genre. We are talking, of course, about Truman Capote's legendary work In Cold Blood. Get ready, because we're going to deconstruct the precise anatomy of a masterpiece and uncover exactly how Capote's stylistic innovation changed the true crime genre forever. Listen to these words for a second. There was something about him, an aura of a lost animal, a wounded creature. Just feel the gravity of that. Those are the surprisingly gentle, chillingly empathetic terms Truman Capote used to describe a ruthless killer. And might away, that signals to us that we are stepping way outside the boundaries of standard reporting. So the big question we're tackling today is, how exactly did a brutal, seemingly senseless true crime become a literary masterpiece? Throughout this explainer, we're going to deconstruct the specific stylistic choices and the exact point of innovation that Capote leveraged to change storytelling from that point on. It's not just about what happened, it's about the entirely new style in which it was told. All right, let's dive into this with Section 1, The Crime in Kansas, November 1959. To really understand Capote's canvas, we have to start with the raw, brutal facts. Picture this. It's November 1959. Holcomb, Kansas is this idyllic, quiet, rural town where people quite literally leave their doors unlocked at night. You've got Herbert Clutter, a widely respected farmer, living a peaceful life with his wife Bonnie and their 2 teenage kids. And then suddenly, that peace is just shattered. 2 men enter their home in the dead of night. They bind and brutally execute all 4 members of the family. And the motive? A random rumor from a former prison cellmate about a safe containing $10,000. But the really tragic reality here, that safe didn't even exist. The killers ended up walking away with a portable radio, a pair of binoculars, and about $40 or $50 in cash. That brings us to Section 2, inventing the nonfiction novel, which is really the core innovation point of this whole story. When Capote read a brief, super dry 300-word article about this crime in the New York Times, it sparked an absolute obsession for him. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive leap he was about to take. At the time, traditional journalism was strictly focused on the who, what, where, and when. It was dry. It was purely factual. But Capote looked at this tragedy and envisioned an entirely new atmospheric approach. He wanted to maintain the absolute factual rigor of a reporter, for sure, but he wanted to inject it with the psychological depth, the narrative pacing, and the intense atmospheric tension of modern fiction. So the crucial point is, he coined a brand new term for this genre, the nonfiction novel. Capote didn't just want to tell you what happened on that terrible November night. He wanted to make you physically feel the cold wind on the Kansas plains. He treated real, breathing people, the victims, the investigators, and the murderers, like complex characters in a novel, mapping out their internal lives and emotional landscapes based on just mountains of intensive reporting. Let's look closer at how he did that in Section 3, Capote's stylistic revolution and the art of true crime. To pull this off, Capote basically had to reinvent narrative structure from the ground up. One of his absolute best techniques was cross-cutting, or shifting points of view. He'd dedicate one chapter to the innocent Clutter family just going about their wholesome final day, and then bam, he'd immediately cut to the 2 killers driving closer and closer across the plains. It builds this incredible, almost cinematic suspense. Plus, he completely avoided moralizing. He didn't preach to the reader at all. He just presented the stark, atmospheric tension and let the deep psychology of the scene speak for itself. But you simply can't write with that level of intimate detail without an exhausting amount of research. Capote's process was intense. He actually traveled to this very conservative town of Holcomb with his childhood friend, who you might know, Nell Harper Lee. And this was a genius move. Capote's eccentric, flamboyant New York persona probably would have completely alienated the rural locals. But Lee's patient, warm demeanor really helped them win the community's trust. They spent months interviewing literally everyone. And remarkably, Capote famously claimed he reconstructed all these facts and complex dialogues into his narrative without ever using a tape recorder. He relied entirely on his highly trained memory so that the conversations he had would stay completely natural. Moving into Section 4, the psychology of the killers. getting inside their minds. Now, what's really interesting here is that Capote found his true narrative anchor not in the investigators, but in the perpetrators. Just look at the stark contrast between the two murderers, Dick Hickok and Perry Smith. On one hand, Dick was the pragmatic, hyper-confident one. He was a bad check writer with a face slightly twisted from a car accident, and he was the one who actually instigated the whole robbery plan. But Perry Smith, entirely different. Perry was a dreamer who actually fantasized about diving for sunken treasure in Mexico. He was physically scarred from a terrible motorcycle crash and emotionally absolutely broken by a deeply abusive and neglected childhood. Over time, Capote developed a profound and frankly dangerous emotional identification with Perry Smith. When Capote looked at Perry, he saw a damaged conscience and a broken biography that really mirrored his own wounded sensitivity. Both of these men had experienced severe childhood abandonment, feelings of deep exclusion, and a heavy sense of being outcasts in the world. Capote actually once suggested that he and Perry were like two people who grew up in the exact same house, but one went out the front door and the other went out the back. And this intense personal bond, it directly shaped the style of the book. Capote completely blurred the lines between the objective interviewer and the subjective confidant. Because he fundamentally understood Perry's pain, he was able to write about a brutal murderer with a disturbing level of empathy and complexity. Now, to be clear, he didn't excuse the atrocity of the crime, not at all, but he deliberately exposed the human fragility hiding right behind the monster, which is exactly what makes the narrative so infinitely haunting. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the cost of a masterpiece, and the toll it ultimately took. Let's look at how this built, because this unprecedented immersion into darkness came with a truly devastating price tag. The murders happened in November 1959. By March 1960, Dick and Perry were convicted and sentenced to death. But then, the appeals process dragged on for 5 incredibly long years, finally ending with their executions by hanging in April 1965. For those 5 years, Truman Capote was literally trapped in his own narrative. Artistically speaking, he desperately needed the executions to happen to provide his book with its inevitable, perfect ending. But emotionally, he was sitting there watching two men he had grown incredibly close to, especially Perry, slowly march toward the gallows. And while their deaths finally allowed him to publish in cold blood and achieve just unmatched fame and literary success, the psychological toll utterly destroyed him. He became heavily reliant on alcohol and drugs. He lost his creative focus. And tragically, he was never able to finish a definitive masterpiece again. His final planned novel, Answered Prayers, was just left in fragments. Capote changed literature forever, without a doubt, but he lost himself entirely in the process. Which leaves us with this final, heavy thought to ponder. When an author treats real, breathing lives merely as narrative material, does achieving absolute stylistic perfection inevitably come at the cost of their own soul? It is a fascinating ethical question that the true crime genre still wrestles with to this very day. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this gives you a whole new perspective the next time you read or watch true crime.
Okay, I am Gabriel Contreras, and goodbye.